My name is Mark Tebboth, and I am an associate professor in the School of International Development, and my research interests really revolve around climate change adaptation. So how people, communities, populations perceive, understand and respond to environmental changes.
So I'm Jo Clarke. I'm a professor in the Department of Art History and World Art Studies. I am an archaeologist by training, but got myself embroiled in climate change matters about 15 years ago when I started working with some climate scientists on paleoclimates, which is sort of a bread and butter for me. But that took me much more into the world of climate change, and subsequently, for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been involved in heritage and the impacts of climate change on culture and heritage, which led to being an author on the most recent IPCC AR6 Working Group 2. What is the reason for us sitting here in this field?
We're here today to just talk a little bit about issues within the field of climate change that we feel are important, and we'll be focusing mainly on the topic of adaptation, how that relates to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I guess then thinking slightly more broadly what we feel are crucial priorities moving forward for international climate negotiations, as well as the upcoming Assessment Report 7 cycle within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they produce assessment reports every 6 or 7 years, which are designed to support governments, policymakers and the international climate negotiations. The crucial things about those reports is the summary for policymakers, which is co-produced between scientists and governments, which I think gives a real sense of ownership to that particular element of the IPCC. And I guess it would be useful for us to just maybe think through some of the knowledge frontiers or the areas related to adaptation where we think there's real potential for the IPCC to make quite significant contributions, or perhaps even where much more scientific research needs to happen to support the synthesis process within the IPCC, particularly for the upcoming Assessment Report 7 cycle. So, adaptation is obviously very critical for the globe, for our population, and it really describes the process through which people are able to respond to changes in the world around them. Adaptation in relation to climate change, I guess, specifically focuses on how people are adapting to changes related to the climate. So that could be things like maybe more intense floods or droughts or changes in mean conditions. And I think there are some significant areas where more knowledge could really support the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to respond more effectively, particularly under the auspices of the Paris Agreement. From my perspective, I think there's Article 4 within the Paris Agreement talks about a global goal for adaptation. And obviously to support progress on that global goal around adaptation, then we need to have a sufficient amount of knowledge to enable us to understand what's happening, what's working well, what isn't working well. And I think it's in this particular area where I think much more knowledge would certainly be appropriate. So for instance, from my perspective, in the research that I do, I think we can see that there are some quite critical gaps around what constitutes success for adaptation. There's been quite a lot of recent research which has highlighted the significant negative impacts of projects which are supposedly there to support adaptation, but actually have maladaptive outcomes. And I think that also relates to the time scale over which we're making those judgments. So something which is potentially adaptive in the short term, say over 12 months or kind of 1 to 5 years, could be maladaptive over the longer term.
That's going to be a big issue, actually, because I think there isn't yet a mechanism by which timescales are properly considered within the IPCC reports. So I think adaptive policies that are put in place because of the way in which governments work, because of the way these policy reports work, they tend to be in the short term. They want to see results because they're putting in,
Sure.
finance to this. So they want to see the outcomes. But some of these outcomes take much longer than, just 2, 3, 5 years, the auditing periods. It might take 10 years, 15 years before we really see the outcomes of those adaptation policies that have been put in place.
Yeah. So I think that, that adaptation pathway, or what pathways are likely to be more effective, more successful, as opposed to what pathways are going to be not as successful or effective, I think is an area where there remains quite a lot of uncertainty. And obviously we also don't want to assume that there's any one single pathway which everybody needs to travel down. So depending on, the local context, a whole host of other different variables will determine which pathways that people choose to.
Agreed. I mean, it's kind of like there needs to be a reflexivity, I suppose, built into these adaptation pathways, so that they can be changed if they're not achieving the goals that are expected of them, I think.
Yeah. And I think that variation with adaptation, I guess, poses another significant issue in relation to global environmental assessments, like the assessments that the IPCC conduct, and that's around our ability to aggregate. It's not straightforward, but aggregating knowledge in relation to mitigation, which you boil down to how much carbon dioxide equivalent is released into the atmosphere, provides, if you like, a universal metric by which we can assess the successfulness of projects or interventions. Whereas my feeling is that that's much more difficult in relation to adaptation, because, the boundaries of what constitutes adaptation are a lot less clear. There's obviously a spectrum from those actions which might be considered kind of pure adaptation to those actions which, I guess, border and inhabit the space around what would be considered more global development interventions.
Yeah, and I mean, adaptation, you're talking about people, aren't you? And you can't quantify people's behaviours. So people are going to do what they're going to do, no matter what kind of, policy you might put in place. And that needs to be somehow taken into consideration, but it's very difficult to quantify it.
Yeah.
And this is also another issue, I think, not an issue, but this is something that the IPCC, I think, could be thinking about more, is how to include or how to measure elements of adaptation, for example, but also other elements of the report that can't be measured. There are so many immeasurables within climate change, adaptation, mitigation less, because you can measure it, obviously, because it's about greenhouse gas emissions. But adaptation is about human behaviour.
Sure.
And that's...
Sure. Well, I think, that gets very much onto your work and your research around heritage, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, the work I've been doing is on essentially what in climate change speak you would call non-economic loss and damage. It even has its initialism, NELD.
We all love a good initialism.
We do love a good initialism, don't we? Yeah. So it's recognised within climate change academic scholarship, but it's something that we would call within archaeology and heritage. We would pretty much call it heritage, or at least we'd call it culture. So those non-economic losses and damages are what we lose when we have to adapt. That are not financial, that are not physical, but are actually about our identities and our memories and our stories, and so these elements, these non-economic losses and damages, really do need a lot more research on them. it's emerging, but I think a lot more work could be done on that for AR7.
Thinking through, I mean, from my perspective in relation to mobility and migration, thinking about the things that people leave behind when they migrate. I mean, some of those are impossible to cost or compensate for. And that's looking, I guess, at, individual movements. And then if you scale that up to think about potentially whole communities needing to move, even, states, if you think about certainly kind of portions of them, then kind of just trying to think through the implications of what that means for those people who are forced to move.
I completely agree. I mean, I've been actually thinking about this quite a lot recently because I've just held a conference on measuring the immeasurable losses and damages of culture and heritage from climate change. And I think it's not yet really hit home what it's going to mean when people are forced to migrate. That might not just be climate change, it's conflict. There are all sorts of reasons why people are forced to leave their homes. For us, one of them, and the best example, of course, is small islands, specifically the Pacific Islands, where Vanuatu has kind of led a charge at COP about how loss and damage is going to be, what the reparation of that is going to be. One thing that I think governments and policymakers really need to recognize is that when people are forced to migrate, and that's people have migrated, time immemorial, but often that's a choice. It's a choice to go from an inhabited region to an uninhabited region, for example, and then set up a new life and a new home in that place. When people are forced to migrate to another inhabited region, then there's an issue of how they are enabled and facilitated to express their culture, their identity, because these are what make societies and communities whole. It is about well-being. It's about being a whole person, a whole community. So that is going to be really important. And the other point that I think that policymakers and governments really need to think about is how you enable people to have agency over their losses and damages, over that migration. You need to give people some control over how and what is lost. And I'm calling this, my new term for this is curated transformation, enabling people to literally curate their own transformational changes.
The point you make around agency is a really valid one, given so much research shows that when people have that agency, or when they are able to exert a choice over whether they remain or whether they leave, it's so much better in terms of outcomes for their well-being or their resilience. And the less agency you have in that process of moving or remaining, the worse the outcomes tend to be. So, that's obviously a critical issue, and something I think which policymakers will need to engage with much more. I think even now there's still a sedentary bias within policymaking. So effective policymaking or effective adaptation implicitly views success in terms of helping people to remain in place in situ. And I think trying to counter that assumption that success or effectiveness is not always about staying put, but it can be about moving, and then thinking through how do you enable or facilitate safe, orderly migration, curative transformation, as you put it, I think would be really important. And it, unfortunately, it's only likely to become more pressing as we kind of move through to the middle of this century.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's one area of research that really is under-researched.
Yeah.
And a lot more could be done on it. It's certainly well recognized, at least anecdotally, that if people have control over the changes that are happening in their lives, they are much more likely to feel okay about that.
Okay, well, perhaps we could move on. Do you think we should move on?
Yeah, okay.
So I think one of the other things that it would be useful to think about is looking, I guess, at the current way in which information and knowledge is presented within IPCC reports, is thinking through how we can kind of better support that process, or are there changes, either quick fixes or things which will maybe take longer time to enable all of the incredibly useful, thorough information that's contained within those reports to be more effectively used. So how can we use it, I guess, to try and to better influence action? And I know this is something that you've flagged previously, is that gap between what we know, not just academically, but what we know in terms of what needs to change, as opposed to what is actually changing on the ground and the speed of that change.
So I've talked a lot about this with colleagues, and yourself, actually. We've had quite a lot of conversation about this. I mean, there is a definite gap between the knowledge, which is now, absolutely incontrovertible, and the actions that governments are taking to, ameliorate the worst outcomes, the worst changes that are taking place. I mean, we have been told that this is the critical decade, and yet there have been very few real changes. I mean, obviously there are incremental changes happening all the time, but incremental changes are not enough now. There needs to be something far more radical, really, if we're going to stop the inevitable happening. And governments just don't seem to be doing it fast enough. They are definitely making changes, but now not fast enough. And I think we're seeing the effects of that anyway, just in the last couple of years. So I think in terms of IPCC reports, the big assessment reports are now too far spaced apart. The changes that are going to happen now leading up to AR7, the reports are not keeping up with those changes.
You're talking about almost the rapidity of the changes that we're seeing biophysically within society.
Absolutely.
Are not going to be captured when you have a 6 or 7 year gap between assessment. And I suppose as well, the time it takes to produce those very comprehensive reports from the cut-off point after which new knowledge is not kind of considered within the review, the production of the different drafts, through to the final reports, and then the sign-offs by the governments. I mean, it takes understandably a very long time. And I mean, some things that we've talked about are, if it's possible, not necessarily whether it's possible to try and either streamline or, I guess, take a more issue-led focus. So looking at things which are critical and timely, and producing much more succinct but rapid reviews of a particular policy sphere, or an area of engagement where there's a real need for knowledge or a synthesis of current understanding to enable those more rapid decisions to be taken.
And I think although the IPCC does not have a remit to action any of the findings, there should be a way in which future reports, and I would recommend that they are yearly, on specific issues that have been highlighted, for example, in AR6, leading up to AR7, a bit like the special reports, but with solutions, embedded in those reports, so that they're not telling policymakers and governments what to do, but they're at least highlighting, and I know that already exists, but I think it could be much more front-facing, really, really highlighting, but, this is the evidence, this is what we know will happen on the basis of the evidence, and this is where we as experts feel that A, B, C, and D might be pathways to kind of adaptation or amelioration, or in its other guise, mitigation of these worst outcomes.
So still kind of retaining, I guess, one of the key founding principles of the IPCC, that it's policy relevant without being policy prescriptive.
Yeah.
But I guess just almost setting out a range of kind of the solution space and then specific pathways within that.
Absolutely.
Within that space.
And I can only see that as being a positive for government. I mean, given that they co-produce these, they will have input themselves, so that I don't see it as kind of a one-way thing. I see it as a dialogue between scientists and policymakers. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that you touched upon there, the special reports, which I guess are kind of issue-led reports outside of the assessment report cycle, and the need for that faster turnaround, whether it would be possible to have, I guess, almost annual updates, so you're not having to completely reassess all of the literature, but you're just looking at areas where the literature is, or knowledge is, developing very quickly, and focusing efforts there to see how our understanding has changed.
Absolutely. And I think that the changes are happening so quickly. The literature is just coming out at speed now, and it really is the only way we can keep up with the literature, I think. And
yeah. Well, I think that it's a very recognised issue, isn't it? There's now so much, an exponential increase in the amount of papers that are published on climate change, and that's not even going anywhere near the fact that we're not touching grey literature, we're not looking at literature produced by private industry, or even
very much. Although I think that it's probably an unknown, and also it's probably not evenly spread how much foreign language literature is included, or at least referenced in IPCC reports.
Yeah. So I think some quite significant and acknowledged gaps in terms of how we look at literature, and perhaps with these maybe faster turnaround kind of thematic or issue based approaches, that could obviate some of those problems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I think we should be looking at, and I know that there is a financial implication, but I do think that a lot of the diagrammatic elements of the IPCC reports should be made interactive, because they really do have quite a sobering. If you see a map of, for example, a map that shows flooding over different time slices and different temperature changes, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. And if you see that map just in 2D, it's nowhere near as impactful if you can actually click on it and see what those changes are going to do. And then you just have the data behind it. But, if more of those, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah, well, I think that started, I guess, in certainly quite a lot of effort was made in AR6 to move along that pathway. But I completely take your point.
I mean, the Atlas in Working Group 1 is absolutely brilliant. That tool will have taken a huge amount of effort to create. But I think there could be others like that,
Yeah. And I think that, that interactivity that you talk about, there's the age-old adage that pictures can, tell 1,000 words. And I think, good figures, good maps, good visuals can be so impactful, as you say. And I think if you add to that they're engaging and interactive, then it has the potential to make what can be quite dense scientific language much more accessible to many more people.
Yeah.
So
and it also reduces the need for so many. At the moment, you might have a map, say, that has Bangladesh, coastal China, showing, a number of different flooding scenarios. This way, you would just have one, and then you just click on it and it will bring those up, rather than the kind of multiple maps within one figure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess, what would be important underpinning those sorts of more engaging and interactive outputs is to ensure that the data underpinning them is also available and accessible. And again, I guess it's important to say that it's not that necessarily the data is kind of hidden or private now. It's just that it's certainly not that easy to kind of trace if you have a figure to kind of trace back from that figure to the kind of the raw data that was used to produce that figure, often because figures are kind of synthesized from different publications using different data sets, and then you're not necessarily having all of the metadata that you need to enable you to work out how to find all of those data sets.
And you want the IPCC reports to be as accessible to as wide a population as you possibly can. So even the Atlas, which actually I had a play with the other day, and I didn't find it immediately intuitive.
Yeah.
It did take me a while to figure out, and I had to read quite a lot of text to try and figure out how it worked and what it was showing.
Yeah.
And it was really what it was showing that was difficult for me to get my head around. Where there are examples online of things that are much more kind of, dare I say, WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get.
Sure. But I guess that kind of alludes to, designing things with a specific end user in mind.
Yeah.
And one of the problems for IPCC outputs is that there are potentially a huge number of end users, which makes it difficult to kind of tailor too much. But I think certainly kind of drawing a little bit more on or engagement with potential end users to understand how they use and perceive interactive tools would certainly help make them more accessible, one would think. Yeah. Okay. And I guess the last thing related to that is probably worth highlighting, and I think again the IPCC is already kind of going down this route, but is to trying to implement its kind of FAIR principles around data. So, making sure that they're findable, accessible, that they're interoperable, and that they're reusable. And I think that underpins a lot of what we've been discussing up to now.
Yes, so there's a justice element, isn't there, I think, to all of this. A lot of the data that underpin IPCC findings are only available through large data sets that require certain kinds of computer programs to use that are not available to many people in many countries around the world. And so there needs to be something downscaled so that the accessibility is more equitable across the globe. It's all very well to have these wonderful big data sets, but if they're not accessible to people who are in the most impacted countries and regions, then it's not equitable across the globe, and that's a real issue I think that needs to be addressed somehow.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that's kind of systemic, isn't it? In that the IPCC is a kind of a reflection of global, not exclusively, but kind of global power to a certain extent in terms of where knowledge is generated, who generates that knowledge.
Exactly.
And I think
so. It isn't generated in the poorest countries. It is generated by wealthy states mostly, with input obviously from low and middle income countries. But how that happens, I think, Well, I could say a lot on that, but I don't know whether I should or not.
We could maybe save that. Yeah. Save that for our second expert interview, Joe.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we've covered a lot of issues, and I think from my perspective, I think particularly in relation to adaptation, I think there are still quite significant knowledge gaps that remain around. I mean, we talked about adaptation pathways, we talked about timescales over which we understand whether or not adaptation is successful. There are issues around, I think, a recognition, certainly currently, that many adaptation projects or interventions result in maladaptation, and around the need to work out how we assess adaptation and move from specific adaptation projects or interventions up to a global understanding of adaptation. And I guess from my perspective, they're some of the issues that will really need to be addressed over the next 5 to 10 years, particularly when we look at how important and increasingly important the need to adapt.
I'll come back to archaeology on this point, actually. Maybe a nice way to finish, given I'm an archaeologist. One of the things that is absolutely clear within the archaeological record is that there is a specificity of cultural change. Even people with under the same environmental conditions in neighbouring regions change differently, make different decisions about how they are going to adapt to very similar conditions. So I think that specificity is something that you can't roll out an adaptation program as if it's some kind of region-wide savior for X, Y, and Z countries. Every community, every community, every society is different, and will want to be able to have a unique, I think, adaptation process.
Sure.
And that needs to really be, and that's really clear in the archaeological record.
Yeah. And I think, that's critical when you think of the current adaptation stocktake that's happening and the next one that will happen in 2026 to 2028. So trying to build in mechanisms to acknowledge and cater for that specificity will be critical.
Yeah. I actually think I think that's probably one of the most fundamental points that we've discussed today. Yeah.
Super. What would we like to, if there was one thing that we would like to see in Dubai at the upcoming COP, what would that be from your perspective?
Definitely non-economic loss and damage. It is something that I strongly feel will have huge implications for how people transform how they transform due to climate change over the next decades. And it needs to be addressed. And it's really only now emerging in the literature, but not in the policy speak. I'm not seeing it there.
Sure. And I think, it will be a critical inflection point. So if we are able to make progress on non-economic loss and damage at the COP, I think that will open up space to make progress in other areas related to climate change. And I think also the converse will be true. So I think if that remains a point of contention, then I think it will, I think a lot of negotiations in other areas will become much more bogged down and progress will be a lot slower.
Agreed. Yeah.